The first thing I saw when I opened my eyes was a water stain on the ceiling. Small, brown at the edges, shaped like nothing in particular. It was directly above my head, maybe 8 feet up, and I stared at it for what felt like a long time before I understood where I was. Grady Memorial, room 4C. The smell of recycled air and floor cleaner told me before the fluorescent lights did. 15 days. That's what the nurse said when she finally noticed my eyes were open. She said it quietly, like the number itself was fragile. 15 days, Miss Cora. You've been with us 15 days. I didn't cry. I didn't ask for Derek. I looked back up at that water stain, and I thought something is wrong. Not with my body, not with the room. Something on the outside. Something that couldn't wait for me to wake up. I was right. By the time you finish hearing this, you'll understand why I say that 15 days unconscious was the most clarifying experience of my life. Not because of what happened to me, because of what happened while I couldn't stop it. Drop your time and your country in the comments right now. I want to know who's awake with me for this one. I bought the condo on a Tuesday in March, 9 years before any of this happened. I remember the exact date because it was raining, one of those Atlanta spring rains that comes sideways and soaks through your coat before you've made it from the car to the door. I stood in the lobby of the building on Peachtree Street with wet shoes and a cashier's check in my bag, and I thought, this is mine. Not ours. Not yet. Mine. Derek and I had been dating 8 months at that point. He knew about the condo. He helped me pick out paint colors the following weekend, stood in the empty living room with a roller in his hand telling me the accent wall needed to be deeper, more charcoal than gray. He was charming about it. He had a way of making his opinions feel like gifts. What he didn't do was contribute to the down payment. What he didn't do was appear anywhere on the deed. What he didn't do in all the years that followed through the engagement, through the wedding at Biltmore Ballroom, through 9 years of a marriage that looked better in photographs than it felt in the kitchen on a Wednesday night, was ever put his name on anything that cost real money. That should have told me something. I was 29 when I bought that condo. I had just made junior partner at Harlow Design Group, a firm that did high-end residential interiors for the kind of Atlanta clients who had wine cellars and didn't flinch at custom millwork quotes. I had been working since I was 19. Waitressing through undergrad, drafting intern hours through grad school, taking every client my senior colleagues didn't want because I needed the portfolio more than I needed the sleep. The condo was what that decade of grinding looked like when it finally took shape. 1,100 square feet on the 14th floor. East-facing, morning light until noon. I paid $214,000 for it. And I cried in my car afterward, not from sadness, but from the specific overwhelm of having done something you weren't sure you could do. Derek proposed 8 months after I closed. We were at canoe out on the deck over the river, and he did it right. He knew I hated public spectacles, so it was just us, and a ring that he'd actually researched a solitaire with a slightly elongated cushion cut because he'd listened when I said I didn't like rounds. I said yes before he finished the sentence. I want to be honest with you about this. I loved him. Whatever came after, whatever I'm about to tell you, I loved him clearly and without reservation for the first several years of our marriage. He made me laugh. He was present. He remembered things. He showed up. But money had always been a soft place between us, and I had always been the one who managed around it instead of addressing it directly. Derek was in sales, commercial real estate distribution, corporate accounts, the kind of work where a good quarter looked like a great year and a bad quarter looked like a personality crisis. His income was volatile, and he spent like it wasn't. When we merged finances after the wedding, I started noticing the shape of his habits. The watches. The bottles at dinner when tap water would have been fine. The weekend trips he booked without checking the calendar or the balance. I didn't fight about it. That was my failure, not naivety, but avoidance. I covered the mortgage on the condo and my studio operating costs from my accounts, and let his income float in and out of our joint checking without tracking it too closely, because tracking it too closely meant having a conversation I wasn't ready to have. By year 6, I had stopped being junior anything. I had left Harlow and started Sable Studio, my own firm. My name on the door, 6 employees, a client list that included 2 developers and a boutique hotel group out of Buckhead. The condo had appreciated to somewhere north of $400,000, and I had never refinanced, never pulled equity, never touched it. It sat there the way early decisions sit when they turn out to be right, quietly doing its work. Derek's company restructured that same year. His territory got reassigned, his commission base dropped. He didn't tell me directly. I found out when a car payment bounced from our joint account, and I went in to reconcile it. That was the first winter I noticed Sienna's name in his phone. I didn't confront him then either. I noted it the way you note a small crack in a wall, something to watch, not yet something to act on. I told myself I was being careful. What I was being was afraid. Afraid of what addressing it would cost, afraid of the specific grief of dismantling something you'd built your adult identity around. So I kept building Sable Studio. I kept taking the morning light in my east-facing living room. I kept loving my husband with one eye slightly open the way you sleep in an unfamiliar place, not fully but enough to feel like you're resting. I don't say any of this to excuse what came next. I say it so you understand that the woman who went into that coma was not a fool. She was someone who had spent years choosing the slower, quieter path when confrontation was available, and that choice, more than anything Derek did, is what I had to reckon with when I woke up. The accident happened on a Thursday evening in January. I was driving back from a site visit in Decatur, a new client's kitchen renovation, nothing unusual. The other driver ran a red light at Candler Road and hit the passenger side of my car at approximately 40 miles an hour. I don't remember the impact. I don't remember the ambulance. The last thing I remember is the radio a song I didn't know the name of, something slow and familiar playing at a volume slightly too low to make out the words. Then the ceiling at Grady. 15 days later, that water stain, the nurse with the careful voice, and the feeling immediate and physical like a hand pressing flat against my sternum that something on the outside had not waited for me. The first full day, I was conscious I slept more than I was awake. That's what they don't tell you about coming out of a coma. It's not like the movies where you open your eyes and you're back present, functional, ready to receive information. It's closer to surfacing from very deep water. You break the top you breathe, and then the weight of everything pulls you back down. Not into unconsciousness, but into a half state, where sounds reach you, but don't fully land. I heard nurses. I heard the cart in the hallway. I heard a television somewhere down the corridor playing a midday talk show, the audience laughing at intervals like punctuation. What I didn't hear was Derek. My nurse that first day was a woman named Patricia, 50s, natural gray locks, pinned up, the kind of calm that comes from decades of watching people in their worst moments. She took my vitals every 2 hours, and she talked to me the way you talk to someone you're not sure is fully listening, which I appreciated because I wasn't fully. At some point in the late afternoon, she asked if there was someone she should call. My husband, I said. My voice came out scraped and thin like something that had been stored wrong. Derek Wynn. His number should be in my intake file. She nodded and left. She came back 20 minutes later and told me she'd left a voicemail. I looked at the window. The light was going gold the way Atlanta light does in January, around 4 o'clock low and slanted, catching dust in the air. I thought about Derek's voice on his outgoing message. You've reached Derek Wynn. Leave a message and I'll get back to you. Businesslike. Always businesslike, even on a personal cell. Did he call back? I asked Patricia the next time she came in. Not yet, she said. She didn't say it the way people say things they're worried about. She said it neutrally, the way medical professionals are trained to deliver information that could go several directions. I told myself he was traveling. He had accounts in Charlotte and Nashville, and he moved between them unpredictably. I told myself he had been here, had sat in the chair beside me, had gone home to sleep in an actual bed after 2 weeks of hospital chairs. I told myself a lot of things in those first 24 hours that I did not examine too closely. On the second day, I asked Patricia about my phone. There was no phone logged in your personal belongings at intake, she said. I had been carrying it. I always carried it in the interior pocket of my coat, the same place, everyday habit so ingrained I didn't think about it anymore. I asked her to check the intake log again. She did. The log listed my wallet, my keys, 1 earring, and my coat. No phone. I didn't say anything. I filed it. On the third day, my sister Renee arrived. She came in the morning before visiting hours technically started, which meant she had either charmed someone at the nurse's station or simply walked past them with the specific energy she carries. Renee has always moved through the world like she has somewhere more important to be and is graciously allowing your space to exist in her path. She came in carrying a tote bag with a container of my mother's sweet potato soup that had almost certainly traveled from Macon in a cooler on the passenger seat. And when she saw me sitting up, she stopped in the doorway for a moment before she came to me. She hugged me for a long time without saying anything. Renee is 4 years younger than me, and she has never once in her adult life told me only what I wanted to hear. It is her most exhausting quality and her most valuable one. When she finally pulled back and looked at me, I could see something moving behind her eyes. Something she was organizing, deciding, measuring against what I could handle. "Where's Derek?" I asked. She set the tote bag down on the chair, adjusted the strap, took a breath that was almost invisible unless you'd known her your whole life. "I haven't been able to reach him," she said. "Since when?" She hesitated. "Since the accident." I looked at her. "Renee." "I've called. His voicemail is full. His work line goes to an assistant who says he's out of office." She paused. "His mother told me he's been under a lot of stress." His mother? Gwendolyn Wynn, who had sent me a fruit basket when I made partner and a card signed with her full name when we got married, who called Derek every Sunday at 11 and had never once called me at all. She knew something, and she'd given Renee the softest possible version of it. I didn't push Renee further. Not yet. I could see she was protecting me from the pace of information, giving me pieces in the order she'd decided I could absorb them. I let her feed me soup and talk about her kids and describe the drive up from Macon in enough detail that I could close my eyes and see the highway. But that evening after she left, I lay in the dimmed room, and I did an inventory. No phone. Husband unreachable for 15 days. A voicemail that wasn't returned. A mother-in-law who answered with stress instead of concern. And one other thing. On the windowsill behind the small, potted succulent the hospital put in all the long-term rooms, there was a white envelope. No name on the front. I had noticed it my first day conscious and assumed it was a get-well card from a colleague or a client. But when Patricia had arranged the windowsill, she'd moved it carefully, deliberately, the way you handle something someone told you to be careful with. I asked her about it that evening. She looked at the envelope, and then at me. "A man dropped it off," she said. 8 days ago. He said you'd know what it was when you woke up." 8 days ago, while I was still unconscious, someone had come to this room while I was lying in this bed and left me a message they trusted my sleeping self to eventually receive. I asked Patricia to hand it to me. Inside was a business card, cream stock embossed lettering, Marcus Holt, J.D. Holt, and Creighton Legal Group, Midtown Atlanta. And on the back in handwriting that was careful and unhurried, Miss Cora. "When you're ready, not before." I held the card for a long time. Someone had known something was wrong before I did. Someone had come here to room 4C at Grady Memorial while I was unconscious and made sure I wouldn't be alone when I woke up. I set the card on the nightstand where I could see it. I did not sleep well that night. Renee came back the next morning with coffee she'd driven to the Starbucks on Piedmont to get because she knew I didn't drink hospital coffee, and she sat in the chair beside my bed with her own cup and her phone face down on her knee, the way she sits when she has decided to be fully present for something difficult. I had the business card in my hand when she walked in. She looked at it. She looked at me. She sat down. "How long have you known?" I asked her. She wrapped both hands around her cup. "Known what specifically?" "Renee." She exhaled, set the cup on the tray table, picked up her phone, turned it over, and pulled up something. She held it out to me without speaking. It was a text message from a woman named Dolores Campbell. I didn't recognize the name, but the message identified her your sister's neighbor on the 14th floor we met at the building holiday party 2 years ago. The message was dated 11 days ago, 3 days into my coma. It read, "Hey, Renee. I don't know if you know this already, but there's been a lot of activity in Cora's unit. Moving truck was here Wednesday. Different people going in and out with boxes. Didn't want to assume, but wanted you to know in case something's wrong." I read it twice. Then I read it a third time, because my brain kept sliding off the meaning. The way a foot slides off wet tile, the information was there. But my body didn't want to process it. Wednesday? A moving truck on Wednesday. That was day 8 of my coma. "I didn't tell you right away," Renee said. Her voice was steady, but her jaw was tight. "You had just woken up. The doctors said no stress, no upsetting news monitor for neurological." "What else?" I said. She took her phone back, scrolled, held it out again. This was a photograph. Dolores had taken it from her doorway, slightly blurred at the edges, the hallway fluorescence making everything look institutional and flat. It showed the open door of Unit 1407. My unit. And through the open door, visible in the background, was furniture I did not own. A sectional in a pale green I would never have chosen. A floor lamp with a paper shade. Someone else's things arranged in my living room like my living room had always been theirs. I gave Renee back her phone. I looked at the window. The morning light was coming in flat and white, the kind of January light that doesn't warm anything, just illuminates. "He sold it," I said. Renee didn't answer, which was its own answer. "While I was in this bed," I said. "While I was in this bed, he sold my condo." I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, but the honest answer is that I felt very little. Not because I wasn't hurt. I was somewhere deep and specific in the part of yourself that keeps track of everything you built before anyone else arrived, but because the hurt was immediately overtaken by something colder and more useful. Something that felt like clarity arriving in a form I hadn't requested. I reached for the business card on my nightstand. "Marcus Holt, J.D. Has he called you?" I asked Renee. "Derek, in the last 11 days. "Once," she said. 9 days ago. He said he was handling things. He said not to worry about the property stuff, that he'd explain everything when you were better." She paused. "He didn't ask how you were." "He didn't ask how you were." I turned the business card over. "When you're ready, not before." "I need my phone," I told Renee. "Or your phone. I need to make a call." She handed me hers without asking who I was calling. Marcus Holt answered on the second ring. His voice was measured and unsurprised, like a man who had been waiting for a call and had decided not to let the waiting make him anxious. "Miss Cora," he said, "I'm glad you're awake." "How did you know to come to the hospital?" I asked. "Your business attorney is Sandra Creighton," he said. "My partner. She flagged an anomaly in a title search 11 days ago and called me immediately. The property at 1407 Peachtree, registered solely in your name, was listed sold and transferred within a 6-day window, while you were listed as incapacitated in a medical facility. He let that sit for a moment. The buyer's agent requested a power of attorney document during escrow, he continued. The document submitted listed Derek Wynn as your authorized agent. Sandra cross-referenced it against the POA on file with your estate documents. The document Derek submitted expired 14 months ago. I closed my eyes. He used an expired power of attorney, I said. He used an expired power of attorney, Marcus confirmed. Which means the sale is void. Which also means that depending on what the DA's office decides to do with it, your husband may have committed fraud, forgery, and theft by deception under Georgia statute. He paused. The buyer has been notified. They are not happy. Their attorney has already been in contact with our office. I opened my eyes. The pale green sectional from Dolores's photograph was still in my mind, sitting in my living room, like a squatter who didn't know they were already being evicted. The money, I said. The sale price. $347,000, Marcus said. The buyer wired the full amount at closing. We're still tracing where it went after it hit the account Derek directed the wire to. $347,000. Wired somewhere while I lay in this room looking at a water stain. Mr. Holt, I said, what do I need to do? Right now, he paused. Nothing. Rest. Get well. My office is already doing what needs to be done. When you're ready to sit across a table from me, we'll talk about next steps. Another pause shorter. But Miss Cora, don't contact Derek. Don't let him know you've spoken to me. Don't change your behavior in any way that signals you know what we know. I looked at Renee. She was watching me with the expression she'd worn her whole childhood when she knew something was about to happen and had already decided to stand next to me when it did. Don't worry, I told Marcus Holt. I'm very good at being still. I handed Renee back her phone. Outside Atlanta went about its Thursday. Cars on Boulevard. A helicopter somewhere distant. The flat, white January light doing nothing for anyone. I sat in my hospital bed, and I thought about Derek standing in my empty living room 9 years ago with a paint roller in his hand, telling me the accent wall needed to be darker. He had been so certain, so generous with his certainty. I wondered if he'd been that certain when he signed my name on a document that had no legal standing in a city where every real estate transaction leaves a paper trail that doesn't care how confident you were when you made it. I was discharged from Grady on a Friday morning, 18 days after the accident. The discharge paperwork took 3 hours. There were forms about follow-up neurology appointments, forms about physical therapy for my left shoulder, which had taken the brunt of the impact forms about warning signs to watch for persistent headaches, light sensitivity gaps in short-term memory. Patricia walked me through all of it with the same steady calm she'd brought to every interaction over the past 3 days, and when she was done, she handed me a folder and looked at me for a moment longer than was strictly procedural. "You've got a good head," she said. "Keep using it." I didn't know if she meant neurologically or otherwise. I chose to take it as both. Renee drove me to her apartment in Decatur. We had agreed on this without much discussion. Going to Renee's was the only option that made sense. And neither of us acknowledged out loud that this was because I had nowhere else to go. The condo had someone else's sectional in it. The marriage had someone else's $347,000 in it. My life as I had arranged it before January had been reorganized without my input while I was unconscious, and the version I was returning to was not the version I had left. I sat in the passenger seat of Renee's Volvo and watched Atlanta go by the window, and I did not cry. I want to be clear about this, not because crying would have been wrong, but because I think people expect a certain kind of collapse. In moments like this one, and I didn't collapse. I had done something in those 3 days of consciousness at Grady that I can only describe as load-bearing. I had taken the full weight of what had happened, examined it, and then set it down somewhere internal where I could access it without being flattened by it. I don't know if that's strength or something more complicated. I know it's what happened. What I felt mostly was specific, not a general grief. Specific losses, itemized and real. The condo, not just as money, but as the first thing I had ever done entirely on my own. The proof that 29-year-old Cora, in wet shoes with a cashier's check, had been right to believe she could. 9 years. The particular shape of a marriage that had worn itself down so gradually that I had confused the wearing for the thing itself. The phone call Derek had made to Renee 9 days into my coma. He's handling things. Don't worry about the property stuff. The extraordinary confidence of a man who believed he had enough time to finish before I could interrupt him. That last one I kept returning to. He had thought he had time. He had operated with the assumption that I either wouldn't wake up or wouldn't be in a position to do anything when I did. That assumption was his first and most consequential mistake, and he had made it, because in 9 years of marriage, he had watched me avoid confrontation so consistently that he had mistaken my patience for incapacity. I had let him make that mistake. I had in fact been building that mistake for him since year 3 every time I chose the quiet path, every time I noticed Sienna's name and filed it away, every time I covered the difference in our joint account and said nothing. I had been so committed to maintaining the surface of the marriage that I had handed him a roadmap to underestimate me, and he had followed it with impressive precision. At Renee's apartment, I slept for 14 hours. When I woke up, it was Saturday afternoon. Renee had left a plate covered in foil on the kitchen counter and a note that said she'd taken the kids to her mother-in-law's and would be back by 6. The apartment was quiet, in the specific way apartments are quiet, when children have just left them a residual energy toys, slightly out of place, a cup on the coffee table with a 1/4 inch of juice in the bottom. I sat at Renee's kitchen table, and I opened my laptop. The first thing I did was log into my business accounts at Sable's studio. Sandra Creighton, Marcus's partner, had already been in contact with my studio manager, Patrice. I found a chain of emails that showed Patrice had been quietly holding things together for 18 days. Rescheduling client meetings, managing the Buckhead Hotel project timeline, telling vendors I was dealing with a family matter. Patrice had been with me since year 2 of the studio, and she ran it with a competence so complete that I occasionally had to remind clients that she was my operations director and not a co-founder. I sent her an email. Short. I'm out of the hospital. Back next week. You've done an extraordinary job. Let's talk Monday. I thought about adding something more. Some acknowledgement of what the last 18 days had required of her, but Patrice was not a woman who needed to be thanked. At length, she would read the brevity as the respect it was. The second thing I did was log into the joint account. The balance was $2,847. Derek and I had maintained a joint checking for household expenses, utilities, groceries, the car insurance on the Audi he drove. We had never merged our primary accounts, which had been a point of low-grade tension between us that I had managed by making sure the joint account never ran low enough to matter. As of 18 days ago, the joint account had held approximately $14,000. Now it held $2,847. I looked at the transaction history. In the 10 days following my accident, Derek had made 11 withdrawals ranging from $400 to $1,800 at ATMs in Atlanta, then Nashville then, and this was the one that made me sit back Miami. The last transaction was dated 6 days ago. After that, nothing. Miami. Derek had accounts in Atlanta. He had work contacts in Charlotte and Nashville. He had no reason to be in Miami that I knew of, no family there, no professional territory there. But Sienna had a sister in Miami. I had met the sister once at a company event Derek had brought me to 3 years ago. She had shaken my hand and smiled the way people smile when they already know a version of you they're not going to share. I closed the laptop. I sat for a moment with the specific satisfaction of a picture coming into focus, not a pleasant picture, but a clear one. And clarity had always been more useful to me than comfort. Then I picked up Renee's landline. She still had one. for reasons she'd never fully explained, and I called Marcus Holt. "Miami," I said when he answered. "We know," he said. "We've been tracking the wire transfer. $280,000 went to an account registered to a Sienna Brooks. Miss Brooks made a cash withdrawal of $40,000 from a Miami branch 6 days ago." "They're spending it," I said. "They're spending it," Marcus confirmed. "Which is actually helpful for our purposes. Spent money leaves a trail, and courts tend to look less favorably on defendants who liquidated stolen assets than on ones who simply misappropriated them." I noted that he said defendants. "Plural. What do I need to do?" I said. For the second time. The same question, but different now, not the question of a woman who had just woken up and didn't know the shape of the thing. The question of a woman who had spent 2 days mapping it. "Monday," Marcus said. "Come to my office Monday. Bring Sandra. We'll walk through everything." He paused. "And, Miss Cora, how are you medically? Are you all right?" It was the first time anyone from the legal side of this had asked me that. "I'm functional," I said. "Good," he said. "That's what we need you to be." After I hung up, I sat at Renee's kitchen table for a long time without doing anything. I thought about Derek in Miami. I thought about Sienna withdrawing $40,000 from a branch ATM cash, the kind of transaction that feels like freedom and functions like a signature. I thought about the expired power of attorney 14 months expired, a document Derek had presumably found in our filing cabinet and submitted without reading the date, or had read the date and submitted anyway because he had made the calculation that I would not wake up to contradict it. I thought about what Patricia had said when she handed me my discharge folder. "You've got a good head. Keep using it." I picked up my fork and I finished Renee's food. I did not call Derek. I did not text him. I did not change a single thing about my digital footprint that would signal I was awake, aware, and no longer lying in room 4C looking at a water stain. I let him have Miami. I let him have the $40,000 and whatever Sienna's sister's apartment looked like, and the specific confidence of a man who believes he has successfully outrun something. Let him be comfortable. Let him stop looking over his shoulder. I had Marcus Holt, and I had Sandra Creighton, and I had Monday morning. That was enough. He came back on a Tuesday. I know this because Renee's neighbor, a retired postal worker named Gerald, who sat on his porch every morning with coffee and an opinion about everything, texted Renee at 8:47 a.m. to say that a man matching Derek's description had been seen entering the parking structure of my building on Peachtree. Gerald had been on neighborhood watch for 11 years and had the situational awareness of a man who considered observation a civic duty. Renee forwarded me the text without comment. I was sitting at her kitchen table with my second cup of coffee and my laptop open to the Buckhead Hotel project files, which I had been quietly working through since Monday. I read Gerald's message. I closed the hotel files. I picked up my coffee and I finished it. Then I called Marcus. "He's back in Atlanta," I said. "We know," Marcus said. "His car crossed the Georgia state line yesterday evening. We've had a notification set up with his license plate." A pause. "He hasn't tried to contact you?" "No." "Good. That tells us something." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "It tells us he still doesn't know you're out of the hospital. He came back because he thinks it's safe to come back." Safe. Derek had done the math and decided that Atlanta was safe. Which meant he had a plan, something he'd constructed in Miami, over $40,000, and whatever Sienna had told him, a version of events he believed he could walk back into and manage. People who run don't come back unless they think they've figured out the story. "What do we do?" I asked. "Nothing yet," Marcus said. "Let him settle. Let him make contact on his own timeline. When he reaches out to you, and he will you answer normally. You're recovering, you're tired, you don't know anything." I had been doing that for 6 days already. It required less effort than Marcus probably assumed. He reached out on Thursday, not a call. A text which told me he'd gotten a new phone or a new number. The message came through as unknown on Renee's cell, which I'd been using since mine had vanished from my hospital intake. The text read, "Cora. I heard you're out of the hospital. I'm relieved. I need to talk to you. Can we meet?" I read it 3 times. I heard you're out. Not I've been trying to reach you. Not I'm so sorry I wasn't there. He had heard. Passive construction, no source named the grammar of a man who had been monitoring the situation from a distance and was now deciding it was time to reinsert himself. I showed the text to Marcus. "Reply tonight," he said. "Keep it short. Agree to meet at the hospital family lounge, neutral ground, public enough that he won't feel cornered, private enough that he'll feel safe talking. Tell him Friday afternoon." I typed, "Yes, Friday, 2 p.m. Grady Family Lounge on 4. Sent it. His response came in 40 seconds. "I'll be there. I'm sorry, Cora. For everything." For everything. The most elastic apology in the English language. It could mean anything from, "I'm sorry I wasn't at your bedside," to, "I'm sorry I committed fraud while you were unconscious," and it committed to none of them. I set the phone down. I went back to the hotel files. Friday came the way Fridays come when you've been counting toward them suddenly after feeling distant for too long. Renee drove me to Grady. She parked in the deck and she looked at me before I got out. "You want me to come up?" she asked. "No," I said, "but stay close." The family lounge on the 4th floor was a room designed to make difficult things feel slightly less so. Soft chairs in muted greens and blues, a window overlooking the courtyard. A coffee station that always had decaf, but rarely had regular. I got there 10 minutes early and chose a chair with my back to the wall, and a clear sight line to the door, which was not something I'd ever consciously done before, and which came to me now as naturally as breathing. Derek arrived at 2:03. He looked the way men look when they've been somewhere warm, and have had time to prepare, rested in the physical sense tension held deeper in the jaw and the set of his shoulders. He was wearing a coat I hadn't seen before, charcoal wool, the kind of purchase that suggests someone has been spending. The gold watch was on his left wrist. It always was. He saw me, and something moved across his face that I had enough distance now to observe without being moved by. Relief, yes, but underneath it the specific alertness of someone checking to see what you know. He crossed the room and hugged me. I let him. His coat smelled like hotel soap and someone else's perfume, and the particular staleness of a long flight. And I noted all of it the way you note weather information, not feeling. He sat across from me, and he looked at my face, and then down at his hands. "I should have been here," he said. "Yes," I said. He looked up. He hadn't expected agreement. He'd expected either anger or forgiveness, the 2 responses he knew how to manage. And I'd given him neither, just a flat, factual yes that gave him nothing to push against. "Cora, I need to explain some things," he said. "About the condo, about—" "How was Miami?" I said. The pause was very small, a fraction of a second. But I had been watching his face, and I saw a door closing behind his eyes fast and practiced the way someone shuts a window when they hear an unexpected sound outside. "I had to take care of some things," he said. "What things, business?" He shifted in his chair. The wool coat made a soft sound against the fabric. "Cora, I want to talk about us, about what happens next. I know things got complicated while I was in a coma," I said. "Yes." He held my gaze. He was good at holding my gaze. It was one of the things that had convinced me early on that he was honest. "I made some decisions that I need to explain to you, about the property. I want you to hear it from me before." "Before what?" Another small pause. before you talk to anyone else about it, before I talk to anyone else. There it was, the actual purpose of Friday at 2 p.m. at the Grady family lounge. Not reconciliation, not explanation, preemption. He wanted to get to me before someone else did, to give me his version first, to coat the facts in a layer of his own framing, so that by the time I encountered the real shape of things, I'd already have his fingerprints on how I saw them. I had talked to Marcus Holt 6 days before Derek sent that first text. I looked at him across the soft green chair, and I thought about 9 years of choosing silence over confrontation. And I thought about how thoroughly he had misread that silence. And I felt something settle in me, like a foundation being poured, quiet and permanent and load-bearing. I did what I had to do to keep us afloat, he said. The words came out carefully rehearsed without sounding rehearsed, the voice of a man who had practiced this in a Miami hotel room. The accident bills, the insurance gap. I had to make a decision fast, and I made it. I know it wasn't. The power of attorney expired 14 months ago, Derek. The room was very quiet. The coffee station hummed. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened and closed. Derek's face did not collapse. He was too practiced for collapse. But something behind it shifted, recalculated, moved to a different position. Cora. The sale is void, I said. The buyer knows. Their attorney knows. Marcus Holt knows. Sandra Creighton knows. I paused. The DA's office has been notified. He stared at me. The wire transfer to Sienna Brooks has been traced, I said. The $40,000 cash withdrawal in Miami has been documented. I kept my voice the same temperature it had been since he walked in, not warm, not cold, simply even. You came back to tell me your version before I talked to anyone else. I talked to everyone else 12 days ago. Derek sat very still in the green chair with his new charcoal coat and his gold watch, and I watched him understand in real time that the story he had driven back from Miami to tell had already been written by someone else. I'm going to need you to leave now, I said. My attorney will be in touch with yours. If you don't have one, I'd suggest you find one before Monday. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He stood up and he walked to the door, and he stopped there for a moment, without turning around the way people stop when they're deciding whether there's anything left to say, and then he walked out. I sat in the green chair for a few minutes after he left. The coffee station hummed. The courtyard outside was bare and gray, the trees still weeks away from anything. I thought about the accent wall. Charcoal, he'd said. Deeper than gray. He had been right about that, at least. Marcus Holt's office was on the 19th floor of a building on West Peachtree that had been renovated sometime in the last 5 years into the kind of space that communicates competence without announcing it. Dark wood, clean lines, no artwork that required explanation. I arrived on Monday morning at 9 a.m. in the first work clothes I had worn since before the accident. A charcoal turtleneck, wide-leg black trousers, my good coat. Getting dressed had taken longer than it used to. My left shoulder was still stiff from the physical therapy exercises. And I had stood at Renee's bathroom mirror for a moment longer than necessary, not from vanity, but from the specific orientation that comes from being in a body that recently went somewhere without you. Sandra Creighton was already there when I arrived. I had known Sandra for 4 years. She had drawn up the incorporation documents for Sable's studio, handled my business insurance restructuring, and reviewed 2 contractor agreements that had contained language she described as aggressively unfavorable, in a tone that suggested the attorneys on the other side had been hoping I wouldn't read closely. She was 61 years old, kept her silver hair in a precise low bun, and had the demeanor of a woman who considered alarm to be a form of inefficiency. She stood when I came in and took my hand in both of hers. "You look well," she said. "I look functional," I said. "Same thing right now." Marcus was at the head of the table, 50s, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who had clearly played football at some point. and had since redirected that energy into litigation. He had a legal pad in front of him that was already half filled with notes in a handwriting too small to read from across the table, and a set of folders arranged with the precision of someone who had done this particular kind of presentation before and knew which order the information needed to land in. He waited until I had coffee and had settled into the chair across from him before he opened the first folder. "Let's start with the property," he said. The condo at 1407 Peachtree had been listed on day 4 of my coma by a real estate agent named Vince Okafor, who operated out of a boutique firm in Buckhead, and who had, according to Marcus, conducted the listing with what he charitably described as insufficient due diligence. Vince had accepted the power of attorney document Derek submitted without independently verifying its validity, a standard check that took approximately 7 minutes on the Georgia Secretary of State's online portal, and that Vince had apparently not performed. "Is Vince in trouble?" I asked. "Vince is having a very bad month," Marcus said. "His E&O insurance carrier has already been contacted. That's not your concern. It's the buyer's attorney's concern. What's your concern is the chain of the transaction." He slid the first document across the table. It was a copy of the power of attorney Derek had submitted. I looked at it for the first time, my signature at the bottom. Is a notary stamped the date of execution. I had signed this document 4 years ago as part of an estate planning update Sandra had walked me through, authorizing Derek to act on my behalf in specific financial matters in the event of my incapacitation. I looked at the expiration clause. Standard language 2-year term automatically expiring unless renewed. Derek had submitted this document knowing it was 14 months out of date. He had looked at the expiration date and submitted it anyway. "He knew," I said. "The document has the expiration date printed on it in 2 places," Sandra said. "It's not fine print." Marcus slid the second folder across. "The sale closed on day 10 of your hospitalization," he said. "Purchase price $347,000. The buyer, a couple de Noyens relocating from Houston, wired the full amount to a closing escrow account. The title company disbursed $329,150 after fees to an account in Derek's name at Regions Bank." He paused. "That account was opened 11 days before your accident." 11 days before. Derek had opened that account 11 days before I was hit on Candler Road. I set my coffee down. "He planned this," I said. It wasn't a question. "We can't prove intent prior to the accident," Marcus said carefully. "What we can establish is preparation. The account was opened. The power of attorney document was located and retained. The real estate agent was contacted." He paused. "What we cannot establish from the documentary record is whether the accident was anticipated or opportunistically used." I understood the legal distinction he was making. I also understood that in 9 years of marriage, I had watched Derek operate the way he moved toward opportunity, the way he read situations for advantage, the particular alertness that came over him when he sensed leverage. I did not say any of this to Marcus. It wasn't useful yet. "The wire transfer," I said. "Walk me through it." Marcus slid the third folder. Of the $329,150 disbursed at closing, Derek had wired $280,000 to an account registered to Sienna Yvette Brooks at a credit union in Fulton County within 6 hours of the funds clearing. He had kept $49,150 in the Regions account from which he had made the ATM withdrawals. Renee and I had tracked Atlanta, Nashville, Miami before the account balance dropped to $3,400. Sienna withdrew $40,000 in cash from the Miami branch, Marcus said. She has since made 3 additional transactions from that account, totaling $23,600. Clothing, furniture, and a security deposit on an apartment in Coral Gables. Coral Gables. A security deposit. Sienna had been furnishing a life in Florida with my money while I was attached to monitors in room 4C at Grady Memorial. "What's left in her account?" I asked. "As of this morning," Marcus said, $216,400. He held my gaze. "We have a freeze order pending. Her bank has been notified. The funds are not going anywhere." I absorbed this. $216,400 recoverable, plus the $3,400 in Derek's Regions account, plus whatever civil judgment the court would assess for damages legal fees, and the specific category of harm that Georgia law recognized when a spouse committed financial fraud against an incapacitated partner. "There's one more thing," Sandra said. She slid her own folder across. This one was thinner. Inside was a single document, a 2-page summary with a header I read twice before it fully registered. It was a prenuptial agreement. Our prenuptial agreement, the one Sandra had drafted 9 years ago at my request, which Derek had signed 2 weeks before our wedding at Biltmore Ballroom. "You included a financial misconduct clause," Sandra said. "Standard in agreements I draft. It specifies that in the event either party engages in financial fraud, deception, or unauthorized use of marital or separate property, the injured party is entitled to retain all separate property, receive a settlement equal to 150% of documented losses, and is released from any spousal support obligation." I looked at the clause. I had signed this document 9 years ago, and then filed it away in the way you file documents you hope you'll never need. Knowing they're there, not thinking about them, often trusting that the architecture of your life will hold well enough that the safety features remain decorative. 150%, I said, of documented losses, Sandra confirmed, which currently stand at $347,000 for the property transaction, plus legal fees, plus the Regions account withdrawals attributable to marital funds. She did the math quietly. "We're looking at a civil judgment in the range of $540,000 to $580,000 before punitive damages." The room was very quiet. Outside the 19th floor window, Atlanta spread in every direction. The downtown cluster, the Midtown corridor, the sprawl of neighborhoods going out toward the perimeter. My city. The city I had built a business in, bought my first property in, made my adult life in. I had signed a prenuptial agreement 9 years ago because Sandra had recommended it, and because some part of me, the 29-year-old woman with wet shoes and a cashier's check and a decade of working since she was 19, had understood even at the altar that the things you build yourself deserve a specific kind of protection. "What about the criminal side?" I asked. Marcus leaned forward slightly. "The DA's office has reviewed the documentation. Forgery of a notarized legal instrument. Theft by deception over $100,000, which is a felony in Georgia. Fraud in a real estate transaction." He paused. "Sienna Brooks received stolen funds with apparent knowledge of their origin. The DA will decide whether to charge her separately or as a co-conspirator. And Derek, Marcus said carefully, is looking at a minimum of 2 to 5 years if he accepts a plea. More if the DA decides to push the premeditation angle." He set his pen down. His attorney, he retained one over the weekend, a man named Fowler out of Midtown, reached out to my office this morning. "Saying what?" "Saying Derek is prepared to cooperate fully and would like to discuss terms. Cooperate fully." The language of a man who had run the numbers in a Miami hotel room and again in an Atlanta apartment over the weekend, and had arrived at the same answer both times. I thought about the family lounge at Grady, the charcoal wool coat. I did what I had to do to keep us afloat. He had said it like a man reciting lines he'd written for himself, the version of Derek, who made hard decisions under pressure, who acted decisively when his wife couldn't. He had believed in that version completely right up until I said the words power of attorney, and watched the belief leave his face like air leaving a room. "Tell Fowler we're not discussing terms," I said. "Tell him we'll see Derek in court, and that his client should make his decisions accordingly." Marcus looked at me for a moment. "You're certain," he said. Not a challenge, a confirmation. "I'm certain," I said. Sandra closed her folder. Marcus made a note on his legal pad. Outside Atlanta went about its Monday. I had walked into this building 9 years ago with a cashier's check in my bag and left with a deed. I had walked into this building today with a prenuptial agreement and a financial misconduct clause and an attorney who had been waiting for me to wake up. The math was different now, but the principle was the same. Some things you build alone, so that when someone tries to take them, there's only one name on the paperwork. Mine. The meeting at Thornton and Associates was scheduled for a Thursday at 11 a.m. Marcus had chosen the location deliberately. Not his office, not Derek's attorney's office, but a neutral conference room at a firm that did corporate mediation. The kind of space designed to make adversarial proceedings feel like collaborative ones. The building was on Marietta Street, 12 floors up, with a conference room that had floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 sides and a long oval table in pale ash wood that caught the morning light and held it. I arrived first. I always arrived first. I wore a black blazer over a cream silk blouse, my hair pulled back. No jewelry except the small gold studs I'd worn since college. I had chosen everything that morning with the deliberateness of someone who understood that appearance in a room like this was a form of communication. Not performance, not armor, but the specific signals sent by a woman who has had 3 weeks to think and has arrived at a position of absolute clarity. Sandra was already there when I came in, reviewing documents at the far end of the table. Marcus arrived 2 minutes later. The Nguyen's attorney, a compact, precise woman named Helen Park, who had communicated exclusively in bullet-pointed emails since the day she'd contacted Marcus's office, came in at 5 minutes to 11 and set a leather portfolio on the table with the efficiency of someone who had already decided how this was going to go. At 11:03, Derek walked in with Fowler. Fowler was the kind of Atlanta defense attorney who wore pocket squares and believed they communicated something about his character. He was broad, silver-haired, the kind of man who filled doorways. He had spent 30 years making people believe that confidence was the same thing as competence. Derek was behind him. He had lost weight since Miami, not dramatically, but enough that his collar sat differently. He was wearing the charcoal coat again, the gold watch. He scanned the room when he entered, the same fast assessment I had watched him do in the family lounge at Grady, and when his eyes reached me, he held the look for a moment before sitting down. I did not look away. I did not look particularly at him, either. I simply occupied my side of the table the way you occupy a space you are entirely entitled to be in. Fowler opened. He was practiced and smoothed, the cadence of a man who'd done this enough times to have developed a rhythm. He outlined Derek's position, difficult circumstances, an injured spouse, a financial gap that required urgent decisions, an administrative error regarding the power of attorney document that reflected haste rather than malice. Administrative error. I wrote the phrase on my legal pad and underlined it once. Marcus let Fowler finish. Then he opened his folder and he spoke for 11 minutes without interruption. And by the time he was done, the phrase administrative error had been replaced systematically, and with documentary evidence, by the following: a Regions bank account opened 11 days before the accident. A title agent who had been contacted on day 2 of my hospitalization. A wire transfer executed within 6 hours of closing. And a cash withdrawal in Miami 4 days later. Helen Park went next. The Nguyens had wired $347,000 for a property that could not legally be transferred. They had relocated their family from Houston, placed their children in Atlanta schools, and were currently living in a furnished rental at $4.200 a month, while the legal status of the condo remained unresolved. She wanted the freeze on the Sienna Brooks account confirmed, the Nguyenz's funds restored from that account pending the civil judgment, and a timeline. Fowler shifted in his chair. And then Sandra opened her folder and she placed a single document in the center of the table, and she slid it toward Derek with the measured precision of someone who has been waiting to do this specific thing and sees no reason to rush it. Derek looked at the prenuptial agreement. Something happened in his face that I had not seen there before. Not anger, not recalculation. Something closer to the expression of a man who has been walking confidently through a room and has just realized the floor is made of something different than he thought. The financial misconduct clause, Sandra said, was executed and notarized by both parties on September 14th, 9 years ago. Mr. Wynn's signature appears on page 2, line 4. The clause specifies 150% of documented losses in the event of financial fraud or unauthorized use of separate property. She paused. Documented losses currently stand at $347,000 plus associated legal fees, plus marital fund withdrawals. The total civil claim against Mr. Wynn is $548,000. The room absorbed this number. Fowler leaned toward Derek and said something in a voice too low to hear. Derek was still looking at the prenuptial agreement. He reached out and turned it slightly as if the angle might change what it said. It didn't. There's also the matter of the criminal referral, Marcus said. The DA's office has the full documentation package. Forgery. Theft by deception over $100,000. Real estate fraud. The decision on charges is theirs, not ours. But I want everyone in this room to understand that our cooperation with that process is not contingent on the outcome of today's meeting. Fowler straightened his pocket square. My client is prepared to offer. We're not here to negotiate, Marcus said. We're here to inform. Miss Cora has already communicated her position. This meeting is a courtesy. A courtesy? I had asked Marcus to use that word specifically. Not a settlement conference, not a mediation. A courtesy, the gesture of a woman who had everything she needed and was offering the other side the opportunity to understand that before the next stage began. Fowler looked at me for the first time since he'd entered the room. Miss Cora, he said with the particular register of a man pivoting to human appeal after the legal ground has failed. I understand you've been through something traumatic. My client recognizes the harm caused and genuinely. Mr. Fowler, I said. He stopped. I had not spoken since the meeting began. 11 minutes of Marcus, several minutes of Helen Park Sandra's delivery of the prenuptial agreement. I had sat through all of it, with my hands folded on the table and my legal pad in front of me and the one underlined phrase on it. And now I spoke, and the room rearranged itself slightly around the fact of my voice. Your client sold my property while I was in a coma, I said. He used a document he knew was expired. He wired the money to a woman he'd been seeing for at least 3 years, and then he went to Miami and spent 2 weeks deciding what story to tell me when I woke up. I paused. The story he chose was that he did what he had to do to keep us afloat. I looked at Derek directly for the first time since he'd sat down. I was in a coma, Derek. I wasn't afloat. I was in a coma. The room was very still. Derek was looking at the prenuptial agreement on the table between us. His jaw was set in the particular way it's set when he was holding something in. I had seen it across dinner tables, in the car, in the hallway outside our bedroom door. I knew every configuration of his face. That was what 9 years gave you, an involuntary fluency in another person's expressions, useful even when everything else had become useless. You set me up, he said. His voice was low. Not accusatory, something more complicated, almost wondering like a man who has just understood the dimensions of something he'd been standing inside of. "You set yourself up," I said. "I just woke up in time to watch." Fowler put his hand on Derek's arm. A containment gesture. Professional and practiced. Derek looked at me for a long moment, and then he looked away out the window toward Marietta Street below, and I watched him do what I had never in 9 years watched him do, run out of something to say. Helen Park cleared her throat. If we could return to the timeline for the Nguyen's fund restoration, and the meeting continued, because meetings do, because the machinery of consequence is indifferent to the personal weight of the moments it contains. We talked timelines, and account freezes, and civil filing dates, and the specific procedural steps by which $216,400 in recoverable funds would begin moving back toward the people they'd been taken from. I took notes in my careful handwriting. Derek sat across the table with his charcoal coat and his gold watch, and the expression of a man sitting inside a room he had built with his own choices, finally able to see the walls clearly enough to measure them. At 12:47, the meeting ended. People gathered their folders. Helen Park confirmed next steps with Marcus in the efficient shorthand of attorneys who have reached an understanding. Fowler steered Derek toward the door, with a hand at his back, speaking quietly into his ear. And I watched Derek walk out of the conference room, the way I had watched him walk out of the family lounge at Grady, with that pause at the threshold that moment of considering whether there was anything left to say. There wasn't. Sandra put her hand briefly on my arm as people filed out a light touch, nothing that required a response. I sat for a moment after the room had mostly emptied at the long, pale ash table in the morning light coming through the two-sided windows with my legal pad and my one underlined phrase, and the particular quiet of a room that has just held something significant and is now simply a room again. Administrative error. I drew a line through it. Then I put my pen in my bag, gathered my folders, and walked to the elevator. Outside on Marietta Street, Atlanta was cold and bright, the January air sharp enough to clarify. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment before I called Renee. She answered on the first ring. "How did it go?" she asked. "The way it was supposed to," I said. She exhaled a long breath that contained everything she hadn't said in 3 weeks. All the mornings of coffee and forwarded texts from Gerald and sweet potato soup heated on the stove. All the restraint of a woman who loved me enough to let me move at my own pace toward a thing she'd been furious about since day 11. "Come home," she said. "I'll make dinner." I flagged a rideshare and stood on the sidewalk and watched a bus go by, with an advertisement on its side for a law firm that was not Marcus Holt's, but probably wished it were. Somewhere across the city, Derek Wynn was sitting in Fowler's car, hearing a revised assessment of his situation. Somewhere in Coral Gables, Sienna Brooks's account was frozen at $216,400, and would remain that way until a Georgia court decided what to do with it. And I was standing on Marietta Street in the cold, with my folders and my coat, entirely in possession of every piece of information I needed, headed toward my sister's apartment and a hot meal, and the specific uncomplicated comfort of being somewhere you are simply straightforwardly loved. It was a Thursday in Atlanta. That was enough. The DA's office filed charges on a Monday 5 weeks after the Marietta Street meeting. I found out the way I found out most things during that period from Marcus by phone, in the measured tone he used when delivering information he wanted me to receive before I encountered it elsewhere. He called at 8:14 a.m. while I was at Renee's kitchen table with my coffee and the Buckhead Hotel project open on my laptop, which had become my morning configuration since returning from the hospital, the work and the coffee arriving together as a kind of discipline. "Charges have been filed," he said. "Forgery of a notarized instrument, theft by deception exceeding $100,000, and real estate transaction fraud. All felonies under Georgia statute." He paused. "Sienna Brooks has been charged separately as an accessory after the fact. She accepted the DA's cooperation offer, which means her testimony is now part of the state's case. Sienna had cooperated. I had expected this, had expected it, since Marcus first used the word defendants plural back in October, but hearing it confirmed produced a feeling I hadn't anticipated. Not satisfaction exactly, something quieter. The particular sensation of a structure completing itself, the last piece arriving, and the whole thing becoming finally what it was always going to be. Derek's arraignment is Friday, Marcus said. You don't need to be there. I'll have someone present. I know, I said. Thank you, Marcus. I sat with the phone in my hand after he hung up, and I finished my coffee and I looked out Renee's kitchen window at the February morning, bare trees, gray sky, the particular stillness of a city that hasn't decided yet what kind of day it's going to be. Then I opened the hotel project and went back to work. The news reached Derek's professional world before the arraignment. I don't know exactly how Marcus had not issued any statement, and the DA's office communications were standard procedural language. But Atlanta's commercial real estate community is a specific ecosystem with its own information channels. And by Wednesday afternoon, 2 of Derek's former colleagues had called Renee's number trying to reach me, apparently under the impression that I would want to discuss the situation with people who had worked adjacent to my husband for 7 years and were now reassessing what they knew about him. I did not return those calls. What I did learn through Marcus was that Derek's employer, the distribution firm, whose Atlanta territory he'd managed, had placed him on administrative leave the day the charges were filed, and had by Thursday terminated his contract. The termination was immediate, without severance, citing a morality clause in his employment agreement that Derek had apparently never read closely enough to internalize. This was the first domino. There were others. Derek had been leasing an apartment in Midtown since returning from Miami. I had not known this until Marcus mentioned it as an aside, the way he sometimes mentioned peripheral facts he thought I should have without making a production of the delivery. The apartment was a month-to-month lease on a furnished unit, the kind of arrangement that signals impermanence, a man between situations. When his employment was terminated, his ability to carry the lease became uncertain, and by the end of the week his landlord had been in contact with Fowler about the deposit. The Regions Bank account, the one opened 11 days before my accident, the one that had briefly held $329, $150 before Derek routed most of it to Sienna, had been subpoenaed. The account was frozen. The $3, $400 remaining in it would remain inaccessible until the civil and criminal proceedings resolved. Derek, as of the Thursday before his arraignment, had his charcoal coat, his gold watch, Fowler's retainer bill, and whatever cash he'd been carrying since Miami. The arraignment was on a Friday. Marcus sent me a text at 11:47 a.m. Derek entered a not guilty plea. Trial date set for September. Fowler is still signaling interest in plea negotiations. I read it at my desk at Sable Studio, where I'd returned to work full-time the previous Monday. My office was a converted Victorian in Inman Park that I'd renovated myself 6 years ago. Exposed brick, the original heart pine floors. A drafting table by the east window, where the morning light came in at the same angle as the light in the condo on Peachtree. I had chosen the space deliberately for that light. Some things you know about yourself early, and everything else arranges around them. Patrice knocked on my open door at noon with a sandwich, and a look that communicated she had opinions about me working through lunch, but had decided this was not the moment to share them. The Buckhead team wants to push the material walkthrough to next Wednesday, she said. Is that workable? Wednesday is fine, I said. She set the sandwich on my desk and started to leave. Patrice, I said. She turned. Thank you, I said. For January, for all of it. She looked at me for a moment with the expression of a woman who has been waiting for this acknowledgement and had decided she did not actually need it and was now receiving it anyway. You would have done the same, she said. Which was true, which was also not the point. She nodded once and went back to her desk. The dominoes continued through February and into March. Derek's termination had a secondary effect I had not anticipated. He had been the primary account manager on 3 long-term corporate contracts for the distribution firm. And when those contracts came up for renewal in February, 2 of the 3 clients requested new representation. This was standard account transitions, triggered relationship reassessments. But the news traveled the way news travels in a professional community where everyone had now Googled Derek Wynn and read the AJC's brief coverage of the arraignment, and the ripple moved outward from the corporate accounts into the broader social geography of his life. His gym membership was at a Buckhead club where 3 of his former colleagues also trained. He stopped going in February. I knew this because Gerald Renee's neighbor had a brother-in-law who worked the front desk. His poker group, a Thursday night fixture for 6 years, 8 men in rotating apartments, the kind of social ritual that functions as male friendship infrastructure, went quiet. Marcus mentioned it the way he mentioned the Midtown apartment lease peripherally because he had learned by now what kind of information I wanted, and what kind I would simply receive without comment. I received it without comment. Sienna's situation resolved itself in a direction I had not choreographed and did not need to. Her cooperation with the DA meant she had avoided the accessory charge in exchange for testimony, but it did not mean her life in Coral Gables continued undisturbed. The freeze on her account, $216, $400. The recoverable portion of the funds remained in place, which meant the apartment in Coral Gables, the furniture, the security deposit she'd placed with such confidence in January, were all suspended against a legal proceeding she was now required to testify in. Her sister, I later learned from a source I will not name, asked her to leave the apartment in Coral Gables within 30 days of the arraignment. The apartment in Coral Gables that Sienna had furnished with my money while I lay in room 4C at Grady Memorial now had a 30-day notice on it. I did not feel satisfaction about this in the way I might have expected. I felt something more, like the recognition of proportionality, the specific geometry of a situation returning imperfectly but unmistakably to the shape it should have held. The call I had not anticipated came on a Tuesday in March. It was a number I didn't recognize. A 404 area code, and I answered it because Marcus had trained me over the preceding weeks to answer unknown Atlanta numbers in case they were related to the proceedings. It was Gwendolyn Wynn, Derek's mother. The woman who had sent me a fruit basket when I made partner and a card signed with her full name when we married, and who had told Renee on day 11 of my coma that Derek was under a lot of stress. She spoke for several minutes. Her voice was controlled in the way of a woman who has been composing this call for longer than she would admit, choosing and discarding words until she arrived at the ones she could deliver without breaking. She said she was sorry. She said she had known something was wrong in January and had not asked the questions she should have asked. She said she had raised Derek to be better than this, and that the failure of that was something she would carry regardless of what the courts decided. She did not ask me to forgive him. She did not ask me to show leniency, to speak to Marcus about plea terms, to consider what a trial would do to the family. She asked for nothing except the chance to say plainly that she was sorry. I listened to all of it. When she finished, there was a silence on the line that neither of us rushed to fill. "Thank you, Gwendolyn," I said. And I ended the call. I set the phone down on my desk and looked out the east window at the Inman Park afternoon. The bare trees filling in now, the first green coming the light, doing what Atlanta light does in March when it finally decides to commit. I thought about Gwendolyn Wynn sitting somewhere her house in Cascade Heights. I assumed the brick colonial Derek had grown up in, composing that call, deciding to make it, deciding what she owed me and whether she could deliver it. She had raised Derek. That was true. And what he had done had not originated in her house, had not been taught there had grown in the specific gap between the man she'd raised and the man he'd become when no one was requiring him to be anything in particular. That was not her fault. And it was not entirely mine either, though I had made room for it. I picked up my pencil and went back to the hotel project. Outside, Atlanta was greening. The dominoes were still falling some. I would hear about some I wouldn't, but I had stopped counting them weeks ago. You reach a point where consequence does its own work, and your job is simply to be elsewhere, building something. That was what I was doing, building something. The civil judgment came through on a Wednesday in April. Marcus called at 9:03 a.m. and read the figure to me with the careful neutrality of a man who had been practicing law long enough to know that the moment a number lands is not always the moment a person knows how to feel about it. $562,000. That was what the court determined Derek Wynn owed Cora Wynn. Ni Cora Elaine Simmons in damages arising from fraud, forgery, unauthorized transfer of separate property, and the financial misconduct clause of a prenuptial agreement executed and notarized 9 years prior. The Nguyen's funds are being restored first, Marcus said. Their $347,000 comes out of the Sienna Brooks account, which we move on immediately. The remainder of your judgment attaches to Derek's assets, the Region's account, his retirement accounts, any future income, until the balance is satisfied. He paused. Fowler has signaled that Derek wants to discuss the criminal plea again in light of the civil outcome. He can discuss it with the DA, I said. That's not my decision. I know, Marcus said. I wanted you to know he's feeling the weight of it. I thought about that for a moment. Derek feeling the weight of it, sitting with Fowler in a Midtown office, going through the arithmetic of what remained to him. The terminated contract, the frozen account, the retirement savings that were now attached to a civil judgment, the gold watch, which was not liquid, and was probably not worth what he'd paid for it. Marcus, I said, is there anything else I need to do today? No, he said. Today you just received the news. I received it. Then I called Patrice and told her to book a lunch reservation for 2 at Staple House, because I was taking her to lunch, and I didn't want to hear any argument about it. She argued anyway, and then accepted. The Nguyen's received their funds the following Monday. Their attorney, Helen Park, sent a brief, precise email to Marcus that said the restoration had been confirmed and that her clients were grateful for the resolution. Marcus forwarded it to me with no added commentary, which was its own kind of eloquence. I thought about the Nguyen's. Sometimes the couple from Houston who had relocated their family, enrolled their children in Atlanta schools, moved into a furnished rental at $4.200 a month because the home they'd paid for could not legally be theirs. They had bought in good faith. They had done everything correctly. The damage to their year was collateral, unintended, and real, and the restoration of their money did not restore the months of uncertainty or the specific disruption of a family's life arranged around a purchase that had turned out to be built on a forged document. I thought about sending them something. A note, something brief and human. In the end, I didn't because Marcus counseled against any direct contact while proceedings were still active, and because I was not sure what I would say, apology felt wrong. The crime was not mine. Acknowledgement felt insufficient. And the Nguyen's had not asked anything of me personally, had conducted themselves through the entire process with a dignity that required nothing from me in return. What I could do was ensure the money moved quickly. It did. Derek's professional world continued to contract through April and into May. The distribution firm's announcement of his termination had been internal but not confidential. And in the specific information ecosystem of Atlanta commercial real estate, internal and confidential were rarely the same thing for long. By April, 3 of Derek's former professional contacts had publicly distanced themselves, one through the mechanism of removing him from a LinkedIn endorsement list, one by declining to be quoted alongside him in an industry publication piece that had been in progress when the charges were filed, and one more directly through a phone call to the firm that had employed Derek, in which the contact indicated he would not be renewing a referral arrangement that had run for 4 years. I learned about these things the way I had learned about the gym and the poker group peripherally through Marcus and through the specific information network that forms around any sufficiently visible proceeding in a city that considers itself a small town wearing a large city's clothes. I did not seek out this information, but I did not turn away from it either. There is a difference between pursuing someone's destruction and simply allowing consequence to complete its arc. And I'd been careful from the beginning to stay on the right side of that line. I had not called his employer. I had not spoken to his colleagues. I had not contacted the poker group or the gym or anyone in the social geography of his life. I had made my legal case, and I had let the weight of it move outward on its own. What moved outward did not need my help. Sienna's testimony in the pre-trial proceedings was by all accounts I received second-hand, thorough, and damaging. She had been with Derek for 3 years and 4 months. She had known about me. She had, according to her own testimony, been aware of the general outline of Derek's plan to liquidate the condo in January. He had told her in December that he was going to use a power of attorney to handle some property matters while I was dealing with health issues. He had not mentioned the health issues were a coma he did not yet know I would be in. He had presented it, she testified, as a planned procedure. Something anticipated something she did not ask too many questions about, because asking too many questions was not the nature of what they were to each other. When the accident happened, and Derek called her from the hospital parking lot on day 1, she had understood what she was part of. She had not stopped it. That was the part of Sienna's testimony I turned over the most in the weeks that followed. Not the knowledge, not the complicity, but the specific moment of understanding what was happening and the decision not to stop it. She had been standing at a crossroads, visible enough to name, and she had stepped in a direction and kept walking. I did not hate her for it. I had tried to in the early days at Renee's apartment, and the hate wouldn't hold its shape. It kept dissolving into something more complicated, more tired, the specific exhaustion of a woman who has spent years in proximity to people who made choices and called them circumstances. What I felt about Sienna ultimately was something close to nothing. And nothing in this context felt like a form of health. Gwendolyn Wynne called again in May. This time, she did not apologize. She asked carefully how I was doing, how the business was going, whether I had been back to the condo yet. I had not been back to the condo yet. We spoke for 12 minutes. It was in the odd geometry of the situation, the longest real conversation I had ever had with her. 9 years of holidays and obligatory dinners, and the particular performance of a wife demonstrating to a mother-in-law that she was adequate. And it had taken a coma and a forgery charge to produce 12 minutes of actual exchange. She told me she was proud of how I had handled everything. I told her I appreciated the call. Neither of us mentioned Derek by name. Neither of us needed to. After I hung up, I sat at my desk at Sable's studio for a long time, without doing anything in particular. The east window was doing its thing. The May light coming in warm and direct, the Inman Park trees fully green now, the city having committed entirely to spring. I thought about 9 years, the specific length of it, the way a decade shapes itself into something that feels structural, load-bearing, necessary, and then you discover that what you thought was foundation was more like furniture, and the house was always yours, and rearranging it does not require demolition. The hotel project was due for its first full presentation in June. Patrice had the vendor schedule organized to the hour. I had 2 new client inquiries on my desk, one from a developer in Old Fourth Ward, and one from a family in Druid Hills who had a 1940s colonial that needed to be brought forward without losing the bones. The Druid Hills family had specifically requested Sable's studio after seeing a project we'd completed in Virginia Highland the previous year. They had come to me through the work, not through any personal connection, not through anyone who knew Derek, or knew what had happened, or knew anything about January at all. They had simply seen a house I had made better, and decided they wanted that for their house. That was the part that steadied me when other things didn't. The work. The drafting table by the east window. The specific and repeatable satisfaction of walking into a space and seeing immediately what it could be with the right attention. I had been doing this since I was 24 years old. I had been doing it through the marriage, and through the accident, and through 18 days in room 4C, and through every morning at Renee's kitchen table with the forwarded texts in the sweet potato soup. The work had not waited for me. It had held, and now I was back at it full time. In the building I had chosen and renovated myself, in a neighborhood I had watched grow for a decade, with a staff of 6 who had kept everything intact while I was away. And a civil judgment for $562,000 attached to the retirement account of a man who had looked at my unconscious body and seen an opportunity. Some days that last part still moved through me like something cold and sudden. Those days I sat with it until it passed, which it always did, and then I went back to work. That was the shape of recovery. Not a line, not a narrative with a clean arc. A practice, daily, ongoing. The decision made again each morning to be present in the life you're building rather than circling the wreckage of the one you lost. On a Friday in late May, I drove past the building on Peachtree. I didn't stop. I was on my way back from a site visit in Midtown, and the route took me past it naturally. And I looked up at the 14th floor as I passed the east-facing windows, 4 of them, the ones that held morning light until noon, and I kept driving. The Nguyens were up there. Their furniture, their children's things. Their life reorganized around a city they'd chosen for reasons that had nothing to do with me, or Derek, or a forged document, or a coma. They were making dinner probably, or homework, or whatever a family does on a Friday evening when the city is warm and the windows are open and the 14th floor is simply home. I drove past, and I did not look back. Atlanta went by on either side, green and loud, and entirely itself, and I drove toward Inman Park. And the office where my east window was waiting, and the Druid Hills file was on my desk. And 6 people were finishing out a Friday in a business that had survived January and February and everything that came after. It had survived because it was built right. Because some things, when you build them correctly, hold. The criminal trial did not happen. Derek accepted a plea in the last week of July, 2 counts of felony theft by deception. 1 count of forgery, a suspended sentence with 5 years probation, mandatory restitution attached to the civil judgment, and 200 hours of community service. Fowler had negotiated it down from the original charge package over 3 months of back and forth with the DA's office, and the DA had accepted it on the grounds that the civil case had already established full accountability and the state's resources were better directed elsewhere. Marcus called me when it was done. He used the same measured tone he always used, the one that delivered information without editorializing. And when he finished, he waited to hear how I received it. "Is that the end of it?" I asked. "The criminal portion, yes," he said. "The civil judgment repayment will continue for years. His income will be garnished when he returns to employment. It won't be fast." "I know," I said. "That's fine." And it was fine. Not in the way of someone who has received everything they wanted, but in the way of someone who has stopped measuring what they have against what was taken and started measuring it against what remains. What remained was considerable. What remained was mine. I had moved back into a new space by then, not the Peachtree condo that belonged to the Nguyens, and I did not want it back even theoretically. What I wanted, I discovered, was something different, something that had not been configured around a marriage or a shared idea of what a life should look like. something I would walk into and find only my own choices reflected back at me. I found it in Inman Park, 4 blocks from the studio. A 2-bedroom on the 2nd floor of a building that had been a textile warehouse. In a previous life, exposed concrete 10-foot ceilings, south and east windows, the bones of something industrial softened just enough to be habitable. The kitchen needed work. The bathroom needed more. I did not hire anyone. I designed the renovation myself at my drafting table by the studio window. And I handed the plans to a contractor I had worked with for 6 years and trusted absolutely. I moved in on a Saturday in June, carrying boxes up the stairs with Renee and her oldest, who was 12, and believed himself to be significantly more helpful than he was, but showed up anyway, which counted for everything. By September, the apartment was complete, not decorated in the way of a space being presented just finished. My furniture chosen deliberately and without compromise. A dining table in white oak that I had sourced from a maker in Decatur who built things to last. Bookshelves I had designed myself, running floor to ceiling on the south wall. A drafting table by the east window that matched the one at the studio because I had decided I would not leave my best thinking only at work. The walls were not charcoal. They were a warm off-white that held light differently at different hours, and I had chosen it myself in the morning, standing in the empty room with paint samples, with no one in the room offering opinions I hadn't asked for. Work had expanded through the summer in ways that felt less like growth and more like arrival. The Buckhead Hotel project was delivered in June to a client response that Patrice described in her economical way as extremely positive. The old 4th Ward developer came back with a second project before the first was complete. The Druid Hills Colonial consumed 3 months and became the kind of work I would point to for years, a house where every room had been thought about individually and together, where the history of the structure and the requirements of the people living in it had been held in equal weight, and neither had been sacrificed. I hired a 7th person in August. A junior designer named Amara, 26 years old, recently out of Georgia Tech's architecture program, who had sent me a portfolio that was technically imperfect and conceptually extraordinary, and who asked in her cover letter not what the position offered, but what the work required. I called her the day I read it. 2 new client inquiries arrived in September. Both were referrals. Both cited completed projects they had seen, spaces they had walked through and recognized as carrying something particular intention they said or care, or some version of a word that tried to name the thing that happens when a space is designed by someone who takes seriously the relationship between where people live and how they feel inside of it. That was the work. That had always been the work. I had never lost sight of it, not in January, not in the hospital, not in the months of legal proceedings and dominoes and phone calls from attorneys and ex-mothers-in-law. The work had remained the fixed point, the thing I orbited back to each time the other things pulled me outward. I understood now that this was not avoidance. I had spent years worrying that my commitment to the work was a way of not dealing with the marriage, and perhaps at certain moments it had been. But I understood now that it was also something else, a form of self-knowledge so deep it had operated below the level of language. A recognition that the life I was building at the drafting table was more real and more mine than the one I was managing in the kitchen on a Wednesday night. The trial had been scheduled for September and was not needed. On the day it would have happened, I went to work at 7 a.m. and stayed until 6:30 and drove home through an Atlanta evening that had finally decided to let summer go the air carrying, for the first time, the particular note of autumn, coming that slight permission in the temperature that says something is ending and something else is allowed to begin. I stopped at the grocery store on Euclid. I bought things I wanted for dinner without consulting anyone. I drove the 4 blocks home and walked up the stairs and unlocked the door and stepped into my apartment, the one with the white oak table and the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and the off-white walls that held light differently at different hours. I stood in the kitchen and I cooked, and the apartment smelled like garlic and olive oil and the specific warmth of an enclosed space, that has been lived in long enough to carry its inhabitants' particular signature. And I thought, this is what I built. Not the condo, not the marriage, not the version of myself configured around another person's comfort with who I was this. This apartment, this kitchen, this dinner, this Tuesday evening in September in a city I had chosen when I was 19 and never seriously reconsidered. I thought about the woman in wet shoes with a cashier's check in her bag standing in a lobby on Peachtree Street in the rain, thinking this is mine. She had been right. She had been right about everything that mattered, and she had spent 9 years doubting it. And the cost of that doubt was significant and real, and also ultimately not fatal. Not fatal. I ate my dinner at the white oak table with the south windows open and the Atlanta evening coming in, and I did not feel the particular hollowness that had lived in my chest since January, not gone exactly, but quieter the way things get quiet when you stop fighting them and simply let them be what they are. Evidence of something that happened, not the shape of what comes next. The Sable Studio client list had 14 active projects by October. Amara had proved everything her portfolio had suggested, and several things it hadn't. Patrice had negotiated 2 new vendor contracts that reduced our material costs by 11%, and had presented me with a summary on a single page, with a handwritten note at the bottom that said, "You're welcome without waiting to be thanked." I had laughed at that for a full minute. Real laughter, the kind that arrives without warning, and leaves you slightly surprised at yourself. On a Saturday in October, I went to the High Museum. An exhibition of mid-century American-designed furniture textiles, domestic objects, the aesthetic vocabulary of a period that believed the things people surrounded themselves with had moral weight, that beauty was not decorative but structural. I walked through it alone and slowly. And I thought about every project on my desk and how each one was a version of this question asked in a specific place by specific people. What should the space I live in say about what I believe a life can be? On the way out, I stopped in the gift shop and bought a postcard of a chair, an Eames. One of the early ones, the organic, shapes the plywood experiments the period before the designs became iconic and therefore invisible. I put it on my drafting table at home next to the lamp where I would see it in the morning. Some people need reminders. I am one of them. Not of failure, not of what was taken, but of the specific thing that had persisted through all of it, the belief fundamental and apparently unkillable that the spaces people inhabited could be made better. That attention paid to the material world was not a distraction from the interior one, but a form of care for it. I had believed this at 24, and I believed it now. That continuity, the thread of it running through everything, through the wet shoes and the cashier's check and the marriage and the coma and the water stain on the ceiling and the white oak table and the autumn evening with the garlic and the olive oil. That continuity was mine. It had not been taken. It could not be taken. It existed in a category of things that other people's choices, however consequential, could not access. 15 days. That's what the nurse had said when I opened my eyes. 15 days. I had lain in that room and felt immediately that something on the outside had not waited for me. I was right. It hadn't. But neither, it turned out, had I. I want to talk to you directly for a moment before we close, because if you stayed through all of this, through the hospital and the attorneys and the conference rooms and the dominoes, then you're probably sitting with something. Maybe it's anger on my behalf, which I appreciate. Maybe it's something you recognize, something in the shape of this story that maps onto a shape in your own life. A person who mistook your stillness for incapacity. A situation you managed quietly for so long that the managing became invisible, even to you. Here is what I know on the other side of it. The years I spent choosing silence over confrontation were not wasted years. They made me someone who could sit across a table from a man who had robbed me while I was unconscious and speak in a level voice about power of attorney documents without losing the thread of what I actually wanted, which was not revenge, was never revenge. It was accuracy, the accurate shape of things, the record corrected, the paperwork reflecting what was actually true. What I lost in those 9 years was not innocence. I was never naive about Derek, not really. What I lost was time. And time is the one thing no civil judgment can restore. So if you're in the middle of something right now, if you're managing quietly, if you're choosing the slower path, because confrontation feels like more than you can hold, I'm not here to tell you you're wrong. I'm here to tell you to know the difference between patience and postponement, between strategy and avoidance, between a choice and a habit you forgot you were making. The prenuptial agreement I signed 9 years ago was the version of myself at 29 saying, whatever happens, make sure there's a document. Make sure something somewhere knows the truth of what you built and who you are. That version of me saved the one lying in room 4C. You are always, in some sense, building for the version of yourself that comes after. Build carefully. Build with your name on it. Build things that hold. If this story meant something to you, tell me what time it is where you are and what part of it stayed with you. And if you've been watching this channel for a while and haven't subscribed yet, this is the one to do it on. Because there are more stories coming, and they are all about this, the extraordinary things that happen when people finally decide to be exactly as powerful as they actually are. Thank you for staying until the end. Some endings deserve to be witnessed.